The small-town Veterans Day ceremony was always a special occasion. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and barbecue, and families gathered at the town square to honor those who had served. Flags lined the streets, and a podium stood ready for the local mayor to give his annual speech. Among the crowd, John Miller stood tall, wearing a military uniform adorned with medals and ribbons. His presence commanded attention, and people around him nodded with respect, some offering quiet thanks for his service. John smiled warmly, shaking hands and sharing brief conversations with those who approached him. He spoke with confidence, recounting tales of his time overseas. A young boy approached him, wide-eyed and clutching a small American flag. "Were you really in the Marines?" the boy asked, his voice full of awe. John knelt to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I was, son," he said, his voice steady and proud. "And let me tell you, being a Marine isn't just about fighting. It's about protecting the people you love." The boy's mother smiled, thanking John before they moved on. Not far away, Mark Reynolds watched the exchange with a furrowed brow. A retired Army sergeant, Mark had attended the ceremony every year since he moved back to town. At first, he thought nothing of John's presence, another veteran here to honor the day, just like everyone else. But something about John's uniform caught Mark's attention. The medals were arranged oddly, and the patches didn't quite match the rank John claimed. Most people wouldn't notice, but to someone like Mark, the details were glaring. Mark crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby lamppost. He listened as John spoke about his deployments, throwing out dates and locations that didn't seem to add up. The unease in Mark's chest grew with every word. As John continued to bask in the admiration of the crowd, Mark pulled out his phone and snapped a discreet photo of him. "Something's off about this guy," he muttered to himself. Mark wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but years of military discipline had taught him to trust his instincts. And his instincts told him that John Miller had a lot more to explain than he was letting on. Mark spent the rest of the ceremony watching John Miller closely, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The longer Mark observed, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. John moved with the confidence of someone who was used to being admired, but Mark noticed small cracks in his facade. His answers to questions were vague, the timelines in his stories didn't match up, and his uniform, while pristine, was riddled with inconsistencies that would go unnoticed by the average person. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Mark walked over to a group of veterans he knew from the local VFW hall. They were men and women who had served in various branches, and like Mark, they knew what to look for. "Did you see that guy over there?" Mark asked, nodding in John's direction. "The one in the Marine uniform?" One of the men, a Navy veteran named Sam, glanced over and shrugged. "Yeah, I saw him. Seemed like he was enjoying the spotlight." "Why?" Mark crossed his arms. "Because something about him doesn't sit right with me. His medals are all over the place, and his stories don't add up. He said he was in Fallujah in 2004, but he mentioned working with a unit that wasn't even deployed there at the time." Sam frowned, his expression darkening. "You think he's one of those stolen valor guys?" Mark nodded slowly. "I'm not saying for sure, but it's worth looking into. If he's legit, I'll eat my words, but if he's not..." He trailed off, the unspoken sentiment hanging in the air. That evening, Mark sat down at his computer and began his investigation. He searched for military records, cross-referenced units and deployments, and even checked databases of known imposters. The more he dug, the more damning the picture became. John's name didn't appear in any official records, and his supposed unit didn't match the patch he wore on his sleeve. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion, and every layer confirmed what Mark had feared. John Miller wasn't who he claimed to be. The next day, Mark decided to test the waters. He visited the diner where John often ate breakfast and casually struck up a conversation. John, ever eager to talk about his service, launched into a story about a covert mission in Afghanistan. Mark listened intently, nodding along, but silently noting every discrepancy. When John claimed he'd been awarded a Navy Cross, Mark almost choked on his coffee. That was one of the highest honors in the military, something no real veteran would brag about so casually. "Wow," Mark said, leaning back in his seat. "A Navy Cross, huh? That's incredible. I've only ever met one guy who had one of those. You must have done something pretty extraordinary." John puffed out his chest, clearly pleased with the attention. "It was nothing, really," he said with false modesty. "Just doing my job." Mark smiled tightly. his suspicions now fully confirmed. He left the diner with a plan forming in his mind. This wasn't just about exposing John for lying. It was about protecting the integrity of those who had truly served and sacrificed. Over the next week, Mark quietly rallied a small group of veterans from the VFW hall. Together, they compiled evidence, including photos of John's uniform, recordings of his exaggerated stories, and the results of Mark's research. They even reached out to a contact in the local news, someone who had covered Veterans Day events in the past and would take the story seriously. Mark's patience was rewarded when he learned that John would be speaking at a fundraiser for a local veterans charity. It was the perfect opportunity to confront him in a public setting, surrounded by people who would recognize the weight of his lies. The night of the fundraiser, the room buzzed with activity. Tables were set up with flags and banners, and veterans from all branches mingled with civilians, sharing stories and raising money for a good cause. John arrived in full uniform, his chest puffed out as he shook hands and posed for photos. Mark watched from across the room, his jaw tightening as he saw John basking in the admiration of the crowd. When it was John's turn to speak, he strode up to the podium with the confidence of a seasoned politician. He launched into a speech about sacrifice, bravery, and the importance of supporting veterans. The crowd applauded, hanging on his every word. Mark clenched his fists, waiting for the right moment. As John finished his speech, Mark stood up from his table. The room quieted as he walked toward the podium, his expression calm but resolute. "Excuse me, John," Mark said, his voice carrying through the room. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." John froze, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. Sure," he said, his smile forced. "What's on your mind?" Mark pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "You mentioned earlier that you served in Fallujah in 2004. What unit were you with again?" John hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines," he said, his voice less steady than before. Mark nodded slowly. "That's interesting, because I know someone who served with that unit, and they don't recall you being there. In fact, your name doesn't appear on any rosters or deployment records." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people began to turn toward John, their expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion. John opened his mouth to respond, but Mark didn't give him the chance. "And that Navy Cross you claim to have earned?" Mark continued, his voice growing sharper. "I checked the official database of recipients. Your name isn't there." John's face turned pale and he stammered, "There must be some kind of mistake." "No mistake," Mark interrupted, holding up his phone. "I've got photos of your uniform, stories you've told, and proof that you've been lying to everyone here. You're not a veteran, you're a fraud." The room fell into stunned silence. John looked around, his face a mix of fear and shame. Some people gasped, while others muttered angrily under their breath. A few veterans in the crowd stepped forward, their expressions hard and unforgiving. "Why would you do this?" one of them asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Do you have any idea what it means to wear that uniform, to earn those medals?" John stumbled backward, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't mean any harm," he said weakly. I wanted to be part of something." Mark shook his head. "You don't pretend to be part of this. You either serve or you don't. And lying about it disrespects everyone who actually did." The silence in the room hung heavy as John stood frozen, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. The crowd's initial disbelief shifted to anger and disappointment. Veterans, civilians, and even the event organizers stared at John with a mix of contempt and pity. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," John stammered, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. I just wanted to feel like I mattered." Mark stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "If you wanted to matter, you could have done it honestly. Volunteered, helped your community, supported real veterans. But instead, you chose to lie, to wear a uniform you didn't earn, and to steal the recognition meant for those who sacrificed everything." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people began filming the confrontation on their phones, ensuring John's deceit would not stay confined to the room. Event organizers quietly approached John, asking him to leave. With his head bowed, he stumbled out of the hall, the applause and cheers from earlier replaced by cold silence. As the door closed behind him, Mark turned to face the crowd. He could see the disappointment etched on the faces of his fellow veterans. "Stolen valor isn't just a lie," he said, addressing the room. "It's a betrayal of the people who gave their lives, their health, and their futures to protect this country. It's up to all of us to honor their sacrifices by holding people like him accountable." The room erupted into applause, not for Mark, but for the truth and the integrity he had defended. Other veterans came forward to shake his hand, thanking him for taking a stand. The fundraiser continued, the mood shifting back to one of celebration for the real heroes in the room. That night, as Mark walked home, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't done it for recognition, he had done it for the countless men and women who had earned the right to wear their uniforms with pride. Their legacy was worth protecting, and that was all that mattered.